They thought they could break me with a petty $600 fine. The HOA claimed I was stealing from the community by fishing on a lake I'd enjoyed for years. At first, I laughed it off. How could anyone actually own a lake? But then came the letters, the threats, and the warnings that I was trespassing in my own neighborhood. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules, it was about control. So, I made one decision that would change everything. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd take away the very thing they were trying to guard. What happens when the HOA suddenly loses the lake itself? Life in our neighborhood was supposed to be simple. I had moved there for peace, for calm mornings by the water, and a sense of community that felt safe and predictable. The kind of place where kids rode bikes without worry, where retirees waved as you passed, and where everyone seemed to agree that we were lucky to have the lake at the heart of it all. For me, that lake wasn't just scenery, it was a piece of freedom. Fishing there was my way of resetting after long days, of reconnecting with the world in a quiet, grounding way. At first, everything felt perfect. The lawn was green, the streets were quiet, and the neighbors were friendly enough. We had block parties, holiday decorations that lined the street in December, and a kind of small town charm that's rare to find anymore. I believed I had found the ideal balance of privacy and community, a neighborhood where life could finally feel steady. But beneath that polished image, there were cracks. The kind most people ignore until they're too wide to look past. The Homeowners Association, what many called the real government of the neighborhood, liked to remind everyone that they weren't just enforcing rules, they were the rules. At first, their letters were minor. Reminders about grass height, notices about trash cans left out too long, warnings about parking slightly over the painted line. Petty things, but easy to dismiss. Still, I noticed a pattern. Those who obeyed without question were left alone. Those who resisted, even slightly, became targets. People whispered about homeowners who pushed back too hard and suddenly found themselves facing surprise fines, endless inspections, and cold shoulders from their neighbors. It was control disguised as order. For me, the first warning sign was subtle. A neighbor mentioned offhand that fishing in the lake wasn't technically allowed without HOA permission. I laughed it off at the time. After all, the lake had been the reason many of us chose this community in the first place. Families gathered around it in summer, kids skipped stones across it, and plenty of us cast a line when the weather was good. No one had ever made an issue of it. Why would they start now? But the thing about living under an HOA is this. What seems harmless today can turn into a battlefield tomorrow. I didn't know it then, but those quiet mornings with a fishing pole in hand would soon spark one of the most ridiculous, drawn-out fights of my life. And it wouldn't just be about fishing. It would become a war over power, over pride, and ultimately, over who really controlled the heart of our community. The first letter arrived folded neatly in a white HOA envelope, the kind you almost mistake for junk mail until you notice the official seal. It was polite on the surface, but the words carried weight. Notice of violation, unauthorized fishing activity. Below that was a fine for $600, citing some obscure bylaw tucked away in the neighborhood's massive rulebook. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Fishing had never been treated as a violation before. Kids splashed in the shallows, families barbecued near the banks, and I had cast my line countless times without issue. Yet here it was in black and white, a fine for doing the very thing the lake was meant for. I set the letter aside, thinking it would blow over. But it didn't. Within a week, another notice followed. This one included a warning that if the fine wasn't paid, further action would be taken. The tone was colder, sharper. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control. Neighbors began to notice. Some avoided eye contact when I walked past, as if my very existence had turned into a spectacle. A few whispered words of support, but quietly, almost guiltily, like they were afraid the HOA might overhear. One neighbor, an older man who'd lived there longer than anyone, pulled me aside and muttered, "They've been itching for a fight with someone. Looks like you're it." That was when the harassment started. Random inspections of my property appeared on my doorstep. Notes citing my lawn being an inch too high, warnings about a trash can not properly secured, and even a claim that my mailbox was non-compliant with HOA standards. It was laughable, except it wasn't funny when the fines started stacking up alongside them. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had been fined for fishing in the lake, yet families still hosted cookouts along its edge. Kids still skipped rocks into the water. None of them received letters. None of them were fined. It was clear I had been singled out. I tried to reason with the HOA board. I wrote letters, sent emails, and even attended a meeting, only to be drowned out by smug faces sitting behind a long table. They claimed the rules existed to protect community resources and to ensure equal access. When I asked why no one else was being fined, their answer was vague. Complaints were filed specifically against your activities. Complaints. From who? No one would say. The next escalation came swift and brutal. A lien notice. If I didn't pay the fines, they warned, they could attach a lien to my property. Imagine that. A man being threatened with losing his home over a fishing rod and a patch of water. That was when frustration turned to determination. I began documenting everything, every notice, every fine, every petty claim of noncompliance. I spoke with neighbors, some of whom reluctantly admitted the board had pressured them into silence. One woman even confessed she'd been threatened with fines herself if she associated with the troublemakers. Still, the pressure didn't let up. One morning, I walked outside to find a bright orange violation tag pinned to my front door like a scarlet letter. It accused me of creating disturbances by openly disputing HOA authority. Disturbances? My only crime had been asking questions and refusing to quietly hand over hundreds of dollars. It was then I realized the HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were running a campaign, and I was the target. The more I resisted, the more aggressive they became. They cut off my access to community amenities. No pool key, no clubhouse privileges, not even permission to reserve a picnic area. To them, I wasn't just a resident anymore. I was an enemy. But enemies fight back. Late one evening, I dug through county records, determined to understand who actually owned the lake. To my surprise, it wasn't owned outright by the HOA. Instead, it was classified as common property, with unusual restrictions tied to the land. The more I read, the clearer it became. The HOA's grip on the lake was not as ironclad as they wanted everyone to believe. That discovery lit a fire in me. If they wanted to play games, I would learn the rules better than they ever had. I began meeting with lawyers, researching property rights, and exploring loopholes that the board had conveniently ignored. Of course, the HOA sensed something was shifting. Their letters grew more desperate. They threatened court action. They warned of escalating legal costs. They even tried to paint me as a danger to the community, spreading whispers that I was reckless, uncooperative, and selfish. But for every move they made, I found another crack in their foundation. One neighbor told me he'd overheard a board member bragging that the fines weren't really about fishing. They were about setting an example. If one homeowner fought back and won, others might follow. And that was the one thing they couldn't allow. The standoff grew unbearable. I couldn't so much as step outside with a fishing pole without feeling eyes on me. Cars slowed as they passed speed. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, and anonymous notes showed up in my mailbox telling me to just give up. I didn't give up. I dug deeper. And then one night, buried in a stack of legal filings and zoning documents, I found the key. A loophole. A way not just to fight the HOA, but to flip the entire game on its head. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't cheap. But if I pulled it off, the very lake they claimed to own could be taken from their grasp entirely. That discovery changed everything. The question was no longer whether I could beat a $600 fine. It was whether I was willing to take away the very thing they were trying so hard to control. The HOA wanted power. I wanted peace. But if it meant protecting my home and my freedom, then I was ready to go to war. And what happens next is something they never saw coming. The HOA boardroom was never meant to feel like a courtroom, but on the night everything came to a head, that's exactly what it became. Rows of folding chairs filled the small clubhouse, neighbors crammed shoulder to shoulder, murmuring in low voices. Some came out of curiosity, others because the board had promised to finally address the disturbances I had been accused of causing. I walked in carrying a folder thick with documents, violation notices, photographs, legal filings, and most importantly, the deed transfer that had been finalized just weeks earlier. My heart pounded, but I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. For months, they had cornered me, shamed me, and fined me into exhaustion. Tonight, I was going to turn the tables. The board sat in their usual line, smug behind their nameplates. The president, a man who had worn the title like a crown for years, leaned forward with a thin smile. "We'll begin with the unresolved violation notices against Mr. He said, his voice carrying across the room. "Failure to comply with HOA regulations, unpaid fines, and continued trespassing on community property. The board has determined." That was my cue. I stood, slid the stack of papers onto the podium, and cut him off. "Actually, I think the board and everyone in this room needs to hear the truth before any more lies are piled on." The murmurs grew louder. I held up the notice for the original $600 fine, reading the language aloud: unauthorized fishing activity. Then I lifted the next notice, and the next, dozens of them, each one more ridiculous than the last. They fined me for my lawn being 1 inch too high. They fined me for a trash can lid. They fined me for a mailbox that's been the same since I moved in. And when none of that broke me, they slapped a lien notice on my home. The room shifted uneasily. A few neighbors gasped. Others stared down at their laps, ashamed. The president smirked. "You've wasted enough of our time. Pay your dues like everyone else, and this ends." That was when I dropped the real bombshell. I slid a single document to the top of the pile, a signed, stamped deed from the county. "You keep calling the lake community property, but as of 3 weeks ago, it's private. Mine." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, even laughter. The president's face drained of color. That's impossible," he stammered. But it wasn't. I explained how I had gone through county records, found the loophole, and negotiated directly with the previous landholder who still technically owned the parcel beneath the waterline. The HOA had been enforcing rules on land they didn't even control. And now, not only did they not control it, they had lost it entirely. The board tried to regain control, banging a gavel, insisting it wasn't valid. But I was ready. I held up letters from my attorney, confirming the sale. I read aloud the exact legal description from the deed, and then I turned to the crowd. "For months, they've told you this lake belongs to the community, but it never did. They bullied me, fined me, and tried to take my home, all while enforcing power they never had. They called me a trespasser. Now the truth is clear. If anyone's trespassing on the lake, it's them." The silence that followed was electric. Then came the whispers, louder this time, filled with anger, but not at me. At them. Neighbors turned to look at the board, their expressions changing from fear to fury. The president slammed his hand on the table. "This is a farce. You can't." But his voice was drowned out by a neighbor shouting from the back. "You've been lying to us all along." Another stood. "You threatened my family with fines too." The room fractured into chaos. The board, once untouchable, now sat shrinking under the weight of dozens of angry stares. Their power was unraveling in real time, the illusion shattered by one undeniable fact: the lake was gone. And in that moment, I felt the weight lift. Months of harassment, humiliation, and fear had led to this, the truth finally ripping through the silence they had forced on everyone. The HOA had set out to make an example of me. Instead, they became the example. And this was only the beginning of their downfall. The days after the HOA board meeting felt almost surreal. For so long, I had lived under the shadow of their constant threats and harassment that waking up without the dread of another violation letter on my doorstep felt unnatural. The silence in my mailbox was the sweetest sound I'd heard in months. But silence didn't mean peace. Not yet. What had happened in that clubhouse spread like wildfire through the community. Neighbors who once looked away now stopped me in the street, some shaking my hand, others whispering apologies for not speaking up sooner. They confessed what I had already suspected. They, too, had been threatened, intimidated, or manipulated by the board. I hadn't been the only one. I had simply been the only one who fought back. And now the fight had changed everything. The lake, once considered the HOA's crown jewel, was suddenly off limits to them. Their community resource was private property, legally protected, and entirely under my control. It wasn't out of spite that I closed access. It was necessity. The board had proven time and time again they would weaponize the lake against anyone who dared to step out of line. The only way to stop them was to take away their weapon. When the first no trespassing signs went up, the neighborhood split in two. Some cheered, relieved to see the board finally stripped of power. Others grumbled, angry that what they once enjoyed freely was now gone. But beneath that surface tension, a deeper shift was taking place. The illusion of the HOA's authority had shattered. For years, they ruled unchallenged, their word treated as law. Now, every homeowner knew the truth. Their power was only as strong as the fear it inspired. And that fear was gone. The board tried to recover. They sent out newsletters claiming I had stolen community land. They attempted to rally residents against me. They even consulted their lawyers, hoping to claw back what they had lost. But the deed was airtight. Their threats carried no weight anymore. Every attempt to intimidate was met with rolled eyes, or worse, outright defiance from neighbors who had finally seen behind the curtain. Within weeks, cracks spread through the board itself. Members resigned. Meetings grew tense and hostile. No longer orderly displays of power, but chaotic sessions where residents demanded answers. Why did you target him? Why did you lie about the lake? What else have you been hiding? The same board that once silenced dissent. Meanwhile, I found a strange sense of peace in owning the lake. It wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about knowing that something they had used as a tool of punishment was now a shield of protection. For the first time in months, I could stand by the water without fear of being watched, judged, or fined. The lake had always been a place of peace for me. Now, it was also a symbol of victory. But it wasn't just my victory. Quietly, almost cautiously, other homeowners began to push back, too. The family down the street refused to pay a ridiculous landscaping fine. Another neighbor openly questioned why HOA fees kept climbing without explanation. People began reading their bylaws instead of blindly accepting them. What had started as my personal battle turned into a quiet rebellion. The HOA had tried to make an example out of me. They had wanted to prove that anyone who resisted would be crushed. Instead, I had proven that anyone who stood up could win. And that realization spread like wildfire. Of course, victory came with its costs. Not everyone was happy. Some neighbors who had grown accustomed to lake access muttered under their breath when I passed. Others accused me of punishing the whole community for the board's actions. And in a way, they weren't wrong. But what they failed to see was that the board had forced this outcome, not me. I hadn't wanted to own the lake. I had wanted peace. It was the HOA that had turned it into a battleground. Still, I didn't let bitterness guide me. I set rules for the lake that were fair, clear, and simple. I allowed respectful neighbors to fish again, with my permission, free of charge. But the board? They were banned. Permanently. After all, it was never about punishing the community. It was about holding accountable those who had abused their power. The irony was not lost on me. They fined me for fishing, and in the end, I became the only one with the authority to fish there at all. Months passed, and the HOA's grip continued to weaken. New board members were elected, ones who promised transparency and fairness. Some of them truly tried to clean up the mess left behind. Others struggled under the weight of the community's newfound distrust. The scars of what had happened didn't fade easily. Every rule they tried to enforce was questioned, every notice met with suspicion. The power they once wielded effortlessly was now contested at every turn. And as for me, I didn't forget the nights I spent wondering if I'd lose my home, the mornings I woke